Okay, we're here with two amazing artists, composer Bekah Simms and the artist and creative technologist Dan Tapper. Now, they've both just created a wonderful new audiovisual composition called Subsume, which we are thrilled to broadcast in about 15 minutes as part of our 50th anniversary commissions for Distanced Ensemble. Dan and Bekah, welcome to NMC.
Hi.
Thank you, Brian.
We are tremendously excited about this bold new work, and so we have questions, so many questions. So let's just jump in. So how did this collaboration come about? Bekah?
Yeah, I'll go first. Sure, thanks. So as Dan might also say, we've just known each other a really long time. He's a close friend of mine, and we've been collaborating pretty frequently over the last 5 years. Starting in 2018, he created this sort of bespoke audio processing for my cello concerto, Brian, which you conducted not so long ago in Revolution Recording in Toronto. So since then, he's designed 3 of my album covers, and he also did live electronics for that album I just mentioned, Bestiaries. And we're also currently co-creating an audiovisual work called Sporewind, which is for experimental jaw harpist Chick White and the Continuum Ensemble. So I just kind of consider Dan like my guy, my forever collaborator. So if there's an opportunity to work for him to work within a project of mine, I will try to make that happen. So he has that really unique skill set of being both a visual and a sonic artist, which is not so common, I find. So I feel like he has a really fleshed out pathway into what I'm doing. So, also whether it's like music or installation or film or people, we always just kind of seem to be on the same wavelength in terms of taste. So I kind of inherently trust him as an artist and collaborator. So it's a bit of a no-brainer to ask him to be a part of this project for me.
Wonderful. And we should mention too that Dan, I think you're from the UK and now you're with us in Toronto. And Bekah, who has been with us in Toronto for so long, is now over in the UK, so you've flipped. So Dan, what drew you to Bekah's work and how was that important for this project?
Yeah, well, I think I realized that I got on with Bekah very, very soon after meeting. I remember we both sort of worked at New Adventures in Sound Art together for a little while. And there was this experience where we were lifting these heavy speakers. And to be honest, it was mainly Bekah doing the heavy lifting there. And a lot of other people sort of not doing the heavy lifting and having little chats. But we got talking about, like, I think specifically Yu-Gi-Oh! And finding out that we had these sort of interests in culture and animation and music really sort of drew me to Bekah just as a person. And then I had an exhibition, I think back in 2017, which is when I first sort of tried to get to do some work with Bekah, which was sort of a New Adventures in Sound Art exhibition that involved basically taking information from space and converting that into music in some way. And I worked with Bekah, my friend Mernaz, and Alison Cameron. And I really wanted to see what Bekah could do with that. And for me, it was my favorite piece of the program. And so then we kind of just started working together on a more regular basis, and always happy to work on Bekah's projects. We have similar sensibilities and tastes, as she said. I can't really top what Bekah just said. It was very, very nice.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, let's talk about the piece. What's it about? Let's start with you, Dan. So what are some of the concepts and themes behind Subsume?
So for me, obviously, like, I got the piece of work once it was relatively fully formed. I got the sort of the electronic music score. We talked about the piece a little bit, and I knew what was going to happen. I knew some of the instrumentation. But for me, hearing the piece and digging into it really changes it, right? So once you have the abstract concept of what something is going to be, it's very different from actually listening to it. And I was really drawn to the tonality of the work. And it got me thinking very deeply about things like microscopy and viruses and cells. And the name also really drew me to exploring this idea of cells eating other cells. And I got really into this field of just looking at electron microscopes and various imaging. And actually, some of the early inspirations came from a university in Scotland, which is now very near where Bekah is based. So that was kind of a nice little flip. So that was my intro to that. And then I started working with digitally trying to recreate some of these materials and thinking about these darker kind of images to make a narrative that would also be somewhat appealing visually.
For me, Subsume is the idea, of an absorption of one small thing into a different, larger entity. And working with this particular range, really broad range of instruments as source material, their differences and their contrasts are quite clear. My challenge was actually to find where they might merge and blur and become kind of a single mass of sounds that belong together. So the title came quite naturally from this idea of thinking about the raw sonic material of the ensemble. Also, I think that concept more broadly, the idea of subsuming, can be kind of grotesque. Like my brain automatically places an organic quality onto the word subsume. So, subsuming concerning life and flesh and almost sort of body horror or psychedelic connotations. I didn't tell Dan any of that. It just, he sort of grabbed onto like some of those elements totally on his own when listening to the work. And I think Dan's video really sort of encapsulates rather that sense of change and transformation, as well as the more itchy and alive organic quality that I wanted to have in the music. I think that they work really well together.
Well, great. That's what I wanted to ask you about is, how much of this is pre-planned? Did you get together and talk first? Dan mentioned something about, speaking about it kind of abstractly at first, or was it just, Bekah, you went and then Dan took it from there with whatever he had?
Yeah, I think Dan and I were sort of speaking very casually about just what the instrumentation was, and that's pretty much all he knew until he had like the completed piece in his inbox. I wanted the audio portion to be able to work independently of visuals as well, but I find that I just trust Dan enough that I don't really need to have much discussion with him when it comes to collaboration. So yeah, he just kind of received a fully formed thing.
Great.
Yeah.
And, yeah, go for it, Dan.
Yeah, so the initial kind of goal was we took this footage of the musicians, and so that was kind of my initial intention, was to really work with that footage and bring that in. But sort of hearing the piece and hearing Bekah's process really changed how I wanted to work with it, because I was getting very non-human forms, and so I kind of took this wholly different tack from hearing the piece. A lot of the ways that I work, I sort of mirrored or responding to some of the stuff Bekah does, which is working with this material, then processing it and reprocessing it and arranging it. So a lot of times when I work with video material, I'm kind of creating something and I'm layering it and then processing it, and it's that same kind of process. And later in the work, particularly, I take these kind of granular textures that Bekah's doing, and I apply the audio to the visual to create this sort of like corresponding kind of granulated visual, which is a really fun thing to try out.
Great. And these collaborations too can be odd for those of us who are used to working solo on a piece, because the end result, when you collaborate, the end result is not completely in our control. So can you both speak about what are some of the unique challenges, but also the benefits when it comes to working on a collaboration where you're not 100% in control? Dan, let's start with you.
Yeah, so often in these projects, I sort of come to it later when the piece has been made. In the case of Forever Dark, that was a really amazing, unique opportunity to sort of create together. So as the piece was being composed by Bekah, I was creating the patch, and we were also working with the cellist Amahl to put things together and working as a sort of a trio, which was really an amazing experience to have that long body of time to put things together. And that's sort of happening with Sporewind as well, where we are working with this jaw harp player and putting that together. But often, in these cases, it's like the work is done and I'm creating some art. And so there's this process where I sort of take it and I try and do my initial responses, and then we kind of have some feedback and we go through that. Sometimes I've really hit it in one go, which is great, and often I haven't. And then try to, especially with like the album cover for Bestiaries, it went through this process of kind of doing a number of kind of iterations of things and then finding out what works best. But no, it's always nice to communicate with Bekah, because she's very exacting and knows what she wants. And sometimes when I haven't got it right, she's not afraid to really tell me, which I appreciate, because it's always hard to sometimes intuit when people are dancing around that point.
So, Bekah, how about you? How about yourself? What are some of the unique challenges and benefits of collaborating?
I think specifically for collaborating with visual art and visual artists, even though I'm really interested in that medium, I possess a great deficit in talent in that area. So the benefit for me is quite clear, because I get to play on like the strengths of another artist, or rather almost borrow the strengths of another artist to go alongside my sonic part of it. You bring somebody to the table that's capable of doing something that you are totally incapable of. So it's just much stronger and fuller with that person involved. I think challenges would mostly come if I weren't so confident in what the artist would produce. Because my music is often quite like abstract and open, usually open enough for audiences to form their own narratives. That's kind of on purpose. I'd be quite disappointed if someone visualized my music in a really tangible, concrete, narrative way. That hasn't really happened, but it's kind of in the back of my mind. It's just like, well, what if they do something that I hate? And as Dan says, I'm not afraid of saying that to somebody, but as someone who has worked collaboratively sometimes, I'm aware of how much more work you have to do if you've done something, someone doesn't like it, and you have to scrap all of it and do it all over again. Like, that's kind of not sustainable, actually. And sometimes they just simply can't fix it and can't change it because there are deadlines and there are other people involved. So that's all sort of all risky business. So with Dan, I find the risk just very small because I'm just so confident in what he's done, and there's been enough collaborations at this point that I think we just understand each other quite well.
Yeah, there's also a big difference actually in the ways that our end results get made, because obviously Bekah does a lot of electronic work, but at the end of the day works with a number of people to make those things happen. Like, there need to be performers and, you know, conductors and all those kind of people to make a project. And for me, I kind of just work on a computer, you know, I work digitally. So we have a different number of people that we have to engage with. So I think Bekah's kind of a bit more adept at sort of being very clear with the direction and the creative side than me, where I kind of get into it and I work on a very individualized level and then kind of like, here's what I did for my bedroom kind of thing. Like, it's a very different, I'm very much like a bedroom nerd who's kind of just doing stuff and then kind of putting it out into the world.
It's wonderful to hear about your process, because I think what your practice is really kind of new and fascinating for many of our NMC audiences. Like, so does the technology, the audio technology, does that translate over to video technology? I mean, can you describe your process a little bit? Does the technology help you in the conception of the work, or just purely the execution, or is it a little bit of both?
I think it's definitely a little bit of both. I spend a lot of time just continuing to learn new technologies and see what's out there and just continue to build on that skill, which means when I come to work on a project, I have almost like a palette of things that I can kind of draw from, and I can kind of iterate and develop quite quickly, which is really helpful, because sometimes like the development of a new kind of visual idea can take a really long time. So it's kind of like this collage process of techniques I've already made when I get there. But in a lot of ways, the technologies are built in tandem, not so much for sort of composed music that's notated, but very much for digital music, because there's a huge scene of sort of VJing that comes from the 90s. And a lot of these tools, like Ableton Live, is developed in tandem with things like Max, MSP, and links really well into things like Resolume and Touch Designer, which is, I use Touch Designer quite a lot for this piece, alongside with some more contemporary sort of artificial intelligence methods. But the software in a lot of ways is kind of built in tandem, which is really exciting if you're a sort of a sonic person, because it makes the transition a little bit easier. And for me, like Bekah, I loved art growing up, but I had no aptitude. I was not a good drawer. I was creative, but not kind of physically skilled. So finding computers that were able to handle all these repetitive tasks and do things that were very precise was amazing for me, and I got hooked.
Great. So Bekah, a similar question about execution versus things like conception. And we were thrilled that, you asked over a dozen of our NMC players to submit material to you based on your instructions. So tablas, Greek lute was in there, bass flute, electric guitar, all kinds of wonderful sounds. So to what extent was this pre-planned, and to what extent was it a reaction to the materials that you received from the players?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it could really go either way. But for me, it was 90%, I would say, it was a reaction and almost a collaboration as well with their sounds and ideas. So for context, as you say, I sent the musicians just a sheet of written prompts, and everyone got the same sheet. So it wasn't sort of specialized per instrument. There was nothing specific notated, but it was more like I wanted to get a collection of their sounds based on general adjectives and instructions, like please record 3 of your noisiest, grittiest sounds, or play a sound that transforms between stable and unstable. And so people obviously interpreted those things very differently. Some players had multiple instruments at their disposal. So I just got like a huge spectrum of sounds, like many hundreds of sounds. So I've used this approach before, sending prompts and composing based on what I get back. And I think it's more creatively surprising and satisfying, to me anyway, to give yourself into the sounds that you receive rather than trying to strong arm the sounds into something you were hoping for or planning for. And I think pre-planning it's just not super compatible with this approach. And that's part of what I like about it, because you get to hyper focus on the raw sounds that you've received and use your ear and really listen as part of your process, and have the musicians themselves kind of lead the sound world. And I'd like to think that because the prompts are general enough, the performers are sending me things that they really like or enjoy playing. So it's a bit of a filter as well. So I get the sounds that the performers feel are most representative of themselves and of their instruments.
Fantastic. No, this is truly fascinating. I wish we could go on and on, because I really love talking about this, and I really love this piece, and I think our audience is really going to get into it. But unfortunately, that's all the time we have today to talk to both of you. So it's been really wonderful to talk about this brand new piece with both of you, and thank you so much for joining us, Dan and Bekah, and congratulations on your world premiere.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks so much. It was great talking.
Great. Thank you both.